The laughter rolled through the auction barn like a slow wave. Men in pressed jackets turned their heads toward the figure near the back, a lean man in a faded work coat boots, caked with Kansas dust, standing alone with a paper number in his hand. Caleb Turner did not flinch. He did not lift his eyes. Then the final lot rolled onto the floor, the one nobody dared to touch, and a single paddle went up. "Saw ya." The room stopped breathing. Harold Briggs leaned forward and said, "You must be out of your mind." The morning Caleb Turner drove into town, the sky over western Kansas was the color of old tin. He kept both hands on the wheel of a pickup that rattled on every seam in the road, and he did not turn on the radio. There was nothing he wanted to hear. The envelope of cash in the inside pocket of his work coat pressed against his chest like a second heart, and he could feel the exact count of it without looking. $3,200. Every bill earned from winter repair jobs, from nights spent under somebody else's tractor, with a drop light and a cracked thermos of coffee. The auction barn sat on the edge of Pratt County, a long metal building that smelled of diesel and damp straw, no matter the season. Caleb parked at the far end of the lot, behind a row of polished dually trucks with dealer plates. His own truck had a dent in the tailgate that had been there since the year his wife died, and he had never fixed it, because fixing it had not seemed important. Very little had seemed important for a long time. Work had filled the hours, and work was what kept food on the table for the one still waiting at home. Inside the big room was already warming with bodies. Professional buyers stood in clusters near the coffee urns, trading numbers and names in that easy way men have when they know each other's bank accounts. Caleb recognized the backs of their jackets. Briggs Equipment out of Wichita, Hollis Brothers, from down by Dodge City, and he kept his distance. He walked past the registration table and signed his name in a careful squared hand. Evelyn Pike was working the office window that morning, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a voice that carried without being loud. She slid him his paddle and a printed catalog and looked at him over the top of her lenses. "Haven't seen you at one of these in a while, Caleb," she said. He told her it had been a couple of years. She told him the coffee was free and the donuts were $1 apiece. And then she told him to be careful today, because there were a lot of sharp suits in the room. He thanked her and moved on. The mockery did not start loud. It never does. It began as a glance, then a smile passed between two men near the front row, then a low comment. Caleb was not meant to catch, but caught anyway. Somebody behind him muttered something about the dust on the boots, about a man who looked like he had wandered in from the wrong century. Harold Briggs, standing wide in a sheepskin jacket that probably cost more than Caleb's truck, turned around and looked him up and down the way a man looks at a stray dog. "You lost friend," Harold said. A few of the men near him laughed. Martin Hollis, tall and thin with a silver beard, laughed the loudest. Caleb did not answer. He had learned a long time ago that answering men like that only gave them a second line. He walked past them toward the equipment yard at the back of the barn, where the machines for the morning's sale were lined up under fluorescent lights. He went row by row, slow, the catalog folded under his arm. He had not come to buy a story. He had come to buy something he could fix. The catalog listed 41 lots. Most of them were the usual auction fare, balers, with good hours, a grain cart with a fresh coat of green paint, 3 skid steers that would go for more than they were worth because everybody wanted one. He passed them without stopping. What he was looking for was the kind of machine nobody else wanted to look at, because those were the machines a man like him could afford. He found it halfway down the second row. A 1992 John Deere 4450, a big 2-wheel drive row crop tractor, its green paint gone chalky, its rear tires cracked at the sidewalls. A hand-lettered tag on the steering wheel said, "Engine will not start. Condition as is." A small knot of buyers was standing near it when Caleb walked up, and he heard one of them say the block was probably cracked, and another one say it was not worth hauling home. Caleb waited until they drifted away. Then he climbed up on the step, dropped into the seat, and put his hand on the wheel, the way a man puts his hand on something he recognizes. His father had run a tractor almost exactly like this one, back when Caleb was young enough to ride on the fender and old enough to remember the smell of the cab in July. He had torn an engine like this apart on a gravel driveway, with his father standing over him, naming every part before he could touch it. Those summers had taught him more than any manual ever did, and it was still in his hands. He climbed down and walked around to the front. He lifted the hood. He did not touch anything yet. He only looked. The engine bay was dirty the way any old engine bay is dirty, but it was a particular kind of dirty dry, even no fresh, weeping at the gaskets, no pooled oil under the pan. He crouched down and ran one finger along the underside of the oil pan, and his finger came up gray with dust, not black with leak. That was the first thing. The second thing was the starter. He could see from where he was that somebody had tried to jump it recently, because the terminals were scratched bright where the clamps had bitten. A man does not jump a tractor with a cracked block. A man jumps a tractor when he thinks it ought to run, and it will not. The third thing was the sediment bowl on the fuel line, the little glass cup most buyers never bothered to look at. Inside the glass, the diesel was the color of weak tea. That told him somebody had let water get into the tank over a wet winter and never bothered to drain it. Water in the fuel would stop a diesel engine dead, and it would do it in a way that sounded to the untrained ear exactly like a dying one. He stood up slowly. He closed the hood with both hands the way a man closes a book he has already read. None of it was certain. The block could still be cracked. The injectors could be gone. A dozen other things could be wrong that he could not see from the outside. But the odds the way he read them were better than any other man in this room was reading them. And the odds were all he had. Behind him, Harold Briggs walked past with Martin Hollis, both of them carrying cups of coffee. Harold glanced at the tractor and then at Caleb and made a small sound in his throat that was not quite a laugh. "You aren't really thinking about that pile, are you?" he said. Martin grinned into his cup. Caleb looked at them both evenly. He said, "I'm thinking about a lot of things." Harold shook his head and kept walking, and Caleb heard him say just loud enough that some men came to auctions to buy and some men came to lose their shirts. The loudspeaker crackled. Raymond Doyle, the auctioneer, was up on the platform, testing his microphone, a big man in a white cowboy hat whose voice could fill a barn without trying. The first lot was going up in 10 minutes. Caleb walked back toward the main floor with the catalog folded tight in his hand and the paddle held down at his side. The $3,200 against his chest felt heavier than it had that morning. He took a seat toward the back. He did not look at Harold. He did not look at Martin. He looked at the old green tractor through the open doors of the equipment yard, and he thought about his father's hands and about a gravel driveway in July, and he waited. The choice was already made, though he had not yet raised the paddle. He would trust what his hands knew, or he would go home the way he had come with nothing to show. There was no third road. There had not been one for a long time. Raymond Doyle opened the sale at 9 sharp. His voice rolled across the barn in that steady auctioneer's cadence fast enough to push the blood, but not so fast that a man lost his place. The first lots went the way. First lots always go. A grain cart to a buyer from Hutchinson, a baler to Hollis Brothers, a skid steer to somebody in the front row who raised his paddle twice and then sat down like he had just bought groceries. Caleb watched without raising his. He let the room settle into its rhythm. He watched the way Harold Briggs bit in short, hard snaps, like a man closing a drawer, and the way Martin Hollis waited until the last second before jumping in just to steal a lot from somebody who had already counted it theirs. He was learning them the way a man learns weather. There was information in everything they did, and he had come there to read it. The old green tractor rolled up as lot 17. 2 yard hands pushed it into place because the engine would not turn, and the crowd's attention shifted the way crowds do when something broken comes in front of them. Raymond Doyle gave the description short. 1992. John Deere as is no warranty engine condition unknown sold where it sits. He asked for a starting bid of $1,000. Nobody moved. He came down to $750. A man in the front row shook his head. He came down to $500. Harold Briggs laughed not quietly this time and said loud enough for half the room to hear, "Ray, you couldn't pay me to haul that thing home." A ripple of laughter went through the rows near him. Martin Hollis tipped his coffee toward the tractor like a man toasting a funeral. Raymond Doyle looked out over the floor patient and came down again. 400. No hands. Caleb raised his paddle. There was a small hesitation in the room. Not a silence, not exactly, but a thinning of the noise the way a field thins when a hawk comes over it. Heads turned toward the back. Raymond Doyle's eyes found him and held a beat longer than they needed to before his voice picked the cadence back up. 400, he said. I have 400. Do I hear 450? For a second, nobody said anything. Then Harold Briggs turned in his seat, looked straight at Caleb, and raised his paddle with a little flick of the wrist. 450. It was not a real bid. It was a man reaching across the room to say, "I see you, and I'm going to make this hurt." Caleb went to 500. Harold went to 550. Martin Hollis joined in at 600, grinning like a boy at a fair. The tractor nobody had wanted 10 seconds ago was suddenly interesting, not because of what it was, but because of who was buying it. Caleb could feel that, and he understood it, and he did not let it move him off his number. He had set a ceiling in his head before the paddle ever came up. $900, not a dime over. Harold bid 700. Caleb bid 750. Martin folded with a wave, laughing like he had only been in it for the sport. Harold went to 800, and then sat there, looking at Caleb with his eyebrows up, daring him. Caleb took the 850. The barn had gone quiet enough that Raymond Doyle's voice sounded twice as big as before. 850. I have 850. Do I hear 9? Harold's jaw worked. Caleb watched him calculate what he did not know. The math of a man who suddenly thinks the other man might know something. 900 would not bankrupt Harold Briggs. 900 would not bankrupt any man in that room except the one in the faded coat at the back. But 900 on a tractor Harold had just called worthless would follow him around for a year, and he could see that as clearly as Caleb could. He let it go. He gave a small, dismissive shake of his head and turned back to face the platform. Raymond Doyle called the lot. Sold $850 to the gentleman in the back. His hammer came down one clean knock, and the barn exhaled. Caleb walked up to the clerk's window and counted out $850 in front of Evelyn Pike, leaving $2,350 still folded in the envelope. She took the bills without a word and stamped his ticket and slid it back to him. When her eyes met his, she gave him the smallest nod, barely a movement, and he folded the ticket into his pocket. He did not even make it back to his seat before Harold Briggs stepped into the aisle in front of him. Up close, the sheepskin jacket smelled of cigar smoke and cologne. Harold was not a tall man, but he used what he had, shoulder set, chin up. Voice pitched for the crowd behind him as much as for Caleb. "I've been buying iron for 22 years, Harold said. "That block's cracked. You just threw away $850 in a trailer ride." The men in the nearest rows had turned to watch. Martin Hollis had his arms folded and a grin on his face that was waiting for a show. Caleb set the ticket deeper into his pocket before he answered. He did not raise his voice. He did not take a step back either. "Block's not cracked," he said. Harold made a scoffing sound. "And how would you know that exactly?" Caleb kept his hands at his sides. "The pan's dry," he said. A cracked block weeps down the back of the casting and pools on the pan rail. That pan's been dry long enough to collect dust. Somebody tried to jump it recently. You can see the scratches on the starter lugs which means somebody thought it should still run. And the fuel in the sediment bowl is the color of weak tea. That's water in the tank, not a dead motor. Drain the tank, change the filter, bleed the lines, it'll fire. He said all of it at the same slow pace, the way a man reads out the price of feed. Harold opened his mouth and then closed it. Something moved across his face that was not quite doubt, but was the first neighbor of doubt. Martin Hollis's grin had gone flat. Behind them, one of the men in the front row, a buyer Caleb did not know, said quietly to the man next to him, "He's not wrong about the pan." Harold heard that. Everybody heard it. Harold rallied. "Talk is cheap," he said. "Let's see you start it." Caleb gave him the smallest shrug. "I will," he said, "when I'm ready." And he stepped around Harold and walked back to his seat. The sale went on. Lots passed. Nobody laughed at the faded coat anymore, but nobody spoke to Caleb either. They watched him the way you watch a stranger in a bar who has just done something you cannot yet decide is foolish or dangerous. He did not bid again. He sat with his hands folded over the catalog and waited for the hours to run. When the last of the morning lots closed, Raymond Doyle called a short break. Caleb went out to the yard. The hands had pushed his tractor off to the side against a line of fencing, and he walked a slow circle around it, and then climbed up on the step again, and sat in the seat with his hands on the wheel and thought about the work ahead. He had no shop. He had a pole barn behind his house with a concrete floor and a single overhead light and a rolling tool chest he had owned since the year he got married. He had a siphon pump, a full set of wrenches, a spare fuel filter on a shelf that would fit a deer of that vintage because he had stocked it himself years back for a job that never came. He had one jug of clean diesel in the bed of his truck. What he did not have was a second chance. If the engine did not catch when he was done, the $850 was gone, and whatever was left in the envelope would not carry him through another season. He thought about that for a long minute, sitting in the seat with the wind coming through the open doors. Then he climbed down and went back inside. The afternoon session opened at 1 o'clock, and the room felt different. Word travels in an auction barn the way fire travels in dry grass. By the time Raymond Doyle stepped back up on the platform, every man in there knew about the exchange in the aisle, knew about the dry pan and the tea-colored fuel, and they were all waiting to see what else the quiet man in the back was going to do. The lots of the afternoon were bigger. A self-propelled sprayer went for $110,000 to a buyer from Nebraska. A combine went for $230,000 to a syndicate out of Oklahoma. The money in the room was real money now, and Caleb sat through all of it without moving his paddle. Then they brought out the last lot. It came through the wide doors on a lowboy trailer pulled by the auction's own yard tractor, and the whole room shifted in its seats to see it. A Steiger Panther four-wheel drive articulated built heavy in the 1980s, when those machines were built like battleships. The paint was faded to the color of dried mustard. One of the rear duals was flat. There was a long black streak down the side of the hood that looked like soot. The tag on the grill read, "Engine fire damage. Sold as is. No warranty. Runs unknown." Raymond Doyle let the barn look at it for a full count before he spoke. Then he said, in a voice that did not try to sell anything, "Gentlemen, this is the last lot of the day. It's a project. I'll be honest with you. I want a starting bid of $5,000. No hands went up. He came down to $4,000. No hands. $3,000. Harold Briggs, who had bid on everything all afternoon, sat with his paddle across his knees and did not move. Martin Hollis had his arms crossed. $2,000. The man from Nebraska shook his head. Raymond Doyle looked out across the rows, and for the first time all day, his voice had a little weariness in it. He came down to $1,500. Caleb raised his paddle. The sound that went through the barn was not laughter this time. It was something else smaller and sharper the sound a room makes when it is trying to decide whether to believe what it has just seen. Heads turned. Harold turned slowly in his seat, and the grin was gone. Raymond Doyle looked down at Caleb from the platform, and for half a second, he did not call the bid. Then he did. 1,500, he said. I have 1,500, do I hear 2,000? Nobody moved. Raymond Doyle waited, and then he waited longer. Do I hear 2,000? Anywhere. $2,000 on a Steiger Panther. Anybody. The barn held its breath. Harold Briggs's paddle did not come up. Martin Hollis's paddle did not come up. Not one man in that room would follow him onto that machine, not because they did not have the money, but because they did not know what he knew, and they were not willing to find out by writing the check. Raymond Doyle's hammer hung in the air for what felt like a long time. Then it came down. Sold. $1,500. To the gentleman in the back. Caleb did not move for a moment. He counted the math in his head. After paying the clerk for the Steiger, he would have $850 left in the envelope. From that, he still had to pay the hauler to move the John Deere home, cover the yard fees on the big machine, and buy whatever parts the Panther was going to need. He had not yet lifted the hood on it. He had bid on a burned tractor he had seen from 30 feet away, on the strength of a black streak down the hood that he thought he could read, and a rear tire he thought he could mount, and a gut he had trusted since he was a teenager. He stood up. He walked to the clerk's window. Evelyn Pike watched him the whole way with something in her face that was not quite a smile and not quite worry, and when he counted out $1,500 for the Steiger, her hand was steady on the stamp, but her eyes were not. She told him quietly that the yard would hold the machine until Monday morning. He thanked her. He folded the second ticket into the pocket with the first. Every man in the barn was watching him when he walked out. The old John Deere came home on the back of a hauler Caleb had called from the cab of his truck in the parking lot. The driver wanted $250 for the trip, and Caleb paid him out of the envelope before they rolled, because he did not want to owe any man more than he already owed himself. $600 left now. The Steiger would stay in the auction yard until Monday, one machine at a time. That was all he could carry. It was almost dark when they backed the tractor off the trailer and onto the concrete pad behind his pole barn. The hauler left. The fields around the house were already black. Caleb stood for a long moment with his hand on the cold front tire and looked at what he had bought. In the low yellow light of the single overhead bulb, the green tractor looked smaller than it had in the barn, and older. He worked until the coffee was gone, and then he made another pot. He drained the fuel tank into a 5-gallon bucket and watched the pale swirl of water come out of the bottom of the diesel, a finger's worth, maybe more. He pulled the filter, and the inside of it was the color he had said it would be. He replaced it with the spare off the shelf. He bled the lines the way his father had taught him, one injector at a time, turning the fuel solenoid by hand and watching the clear fuel finally push the air out clean. His hands remembered. They always did. It was past 2 in the morning when he climbed into the seat and turned the key. The engine cranked. It cranked a second time. On the third turn, it caught and held rough for about 10 seconds, and then it smoothed out into that deep, even idle. A Deere of that vintage makes the idle Caleb had heard in his father's yard 1,000 times as a boy. He sat in the cab and let it run, and he did not move for a long time. He was not celebrating. He was listening. He shut it down after 4 minutes. He did not need more than that. He walked to the house and slept for 3 hours in his work clothes on top of the covers. Monday morning, he hauled it into town to a dealer he had worked for off and on for 15 years. The dealer's name was on a sign by the road, and his handshake was the kind that meant something. Caleb let him start the tractor himself and walk around it and put a gauge on the hydraulics, and when the dealer came back to the office, he wrote Caleb a check for $4,200 and did not argue the number. The check went into the envelope, and the envelope went back into the pocket, and Caleb drove straight from there to the auction yard. The The Steiger was still where they had left it, parked along the back fence with the black streak down the side of its hood, and this time he had the whole machine to himself and a set of tools in the bed of the truck. He spent the morning on it. The fire had been an oil line, not a block, and the damage was cosmetic on the hood and ugly but shallow in the engine bay. The turbo was sound. The block when he pulled the valve cover was clean underneath the char. The flat rear dual was a tire, and a tire was a thing money could fix. He knew within an hour what he had bought. He had bought a machine that was going to run. Harold Briggs found him there around noon. Caleb heard the sheepskin jacket before he saw it, the heavy tread on the gravel, and the throat clearing that was Harold Briggs, announcing himself the way some men announce themselves in every room they enter. Caleb did not look up from the fitting he was tightening. Harold stood at the front of the machine with his hands in his pockets and watched him work for a while before he spoke. "You gonna get that thing running?" Harold said. It was not quite a question. Caleb said, "Yep." Harold nodded slowly. He looked at the hood, and then at the engine bay, and then at Caleb. "Where'd you learn your iron?" he said. Caleb wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at him for the first time. "My father," he said. "On a gravel drive outside of Greensburg, every summer I can remember." Harold took that in. His mouth worked the way a man's mouth works when he is rearranging something in his head that he had thought was already settled. "I owe you an apology," Harold said. He did not say it loud. He said it the way a man says a thing he has practiced on the way over. Caleb folded the rag and put it in his back pocket. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You just owe yourself a second look next time." Harold held his eyes for a beat, and then gave one short nod, and then he walked back to his truck without shaking hands, because there are men who shake hands, and men who do not. And some things between two men are finished without being touched. Caleb finished the Steiger in his pole barn over the next 9 days. He took the hood off and beat the dents out with a rubber mallet and a dolly, and primed it, and painted it the nearest yellow he could match out of a rattle can, which was not the factory color, but was close enough that a man across a yard would not argue. He replaced the oil line that had burned. He pulled the injectors and had them tested at a shop 2 counties over, and 2 of them needed rebuilding, and he paid $400 for that out of the envelope, and came home with a set of injectors that sprayed clean. He mounted a used dual on the rear from a set he had been sitting on for 3 years, waiting for a reason. On the 10th day, he turned the key, and the big 4-wheel drive came alive under him with a roar that rattled the tin on the pole barn roof, and he sat in the cab and let it idle, and something tight in his chest eased a quarter turn. He sold the Steiger 3 weeks later to a farmer outside of Liberal, Kansas for $31,000. The farmer drove up in a mud-spattered truck and walked around the machine twice and climbed into the cab and ran it through the gears in the field behind Caleb's house and came back down and wrote the check on the hood. He told Caleb he had been looking for a Panther for 2 years and had not found one he trusted. Caleb told him this one he could trust. The farmer said he believed him, and it was clear from the way he said it that somebody in the county had told him about the man at the auction and that the story had already started to travel. It went on traveling. Over the winter, Caleb's phone began to ring in a way it had not rung in years. A man from Hollis Brothers called, not Martin, but one of the younger cousins, and asked if Caleb would look at a combine they had taken in on trade and could not get to start. Caleb drove down to Dodge City on a Tuesday and diagnosed a failed crank position sensor in about 20 minutes, and they paid him $300 and asked if he would come back the next month. He said he would. Harold Briggs called in February. He did not apologize a second time because a man like Harold apologizes once. He asked in that flat Wichita voice whether Caleb would be interested in pre-inspecting a line of equipment coming out of a bankruptcy sale down in Oklahoma, because Harold had capital and Caleb had eyes, and between the two of them there was a living to be made that neither of them was making alone. Caleb told him he would think about it. He thought about it for 2 days, And then he called Harold back and said yes, on the condition that his name went on the work order, and his fee was agreed in writing before the first machine was looked at. Harold laughed, once a short, real laugh this time, and said that sounded about right. By the following fall, Caleb was driving a different truck, a used 3/4 ton, with no dent in the tailgate, and the pole barn behind his house had a second overhead light, and a welder he had not been able to afford for 15 years. He still wore the faded work coat because the coat worked, and a man who had been laughed at in a coat once is not easily made to change it. On an afternoon in October, he was back in the auction barn in Pratt County, standing near the coffee urns this time, when a young buyer he had never seen before came up and introduced himself and asked a little nervous whether Caleb would be willing to walk the yard with him and point out what was worth a bid. Caleb looked at the young man's clean boots and his new paddle and his careful eyes, and he remembered a morning not so long ago when he had walked into this same barn with $3,200 against his chest and nobody in the room willing to meet his eye. He said, "Come on," and they walked out into the yard together in the thin fall light. What the old buyers had missed, and what Harold Briggs had finally learned, and what the young man would learn that afternoon if he paid attention, was not a trick or a secret or a stroke of luck. It was only this: a man's worth is not in the cut of his coat, or the shine of his truck, or the noise he makes in a room. It is in what his hands know and what he is willing to stand behind, when no other hand in the room will go up with his. Caleb Turner had stood behind his once, on a morning when nobody thought he should have. The rest of his life had been built on that one raised paddle.